Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing Hiroshima by John Hersey. I read this recently with some friends. I found out that it was a book some people read in high school. It was not one that I read in high school, and I wish that I had. It's a nonfiction story that weaves together six different survivors from the bombing. And the first part of the book describes the days, the weeks, the months after the bombing. And then the second part of the book is the years and decades after what happened to these six different people. I think it's difficult to think of this book in isolation because here you could be reading it. I'm doing this book review at the end of 2025, and we're in a world in which the United States is some moral authority on who is allowed to have nuclear weapons. The United States, the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons offensively and has used it against two civilian populations. The idea that the United States would be the moral arbiter of who is allowed to have nuclear weapons, that is the ridiculous situation we're living with so many years removed from 1945. Here in 2025, this is the clown world that we live in. So part of that is reflecting on the war crimes of these two atomic bomb droppings. I can't get away from that as I read this. But the enduring lesson I take from this is the powerful influence of the Japanese culture and the ability of a culture to turn on a dime when a defeat is clear and they move forward in their society. Not just the defeat for the nation, but the destruction of their city. What I saw over and over were hallmarks of Japanese culture that allowed them to move forward. Now, obviously, as a Christian, I don't celebrate all aspects of Japanese culture. Obviously, there's the history of the martyred Japanese Christians, where Japan considered Christianity, Catholicism, a foreign religion, and banned priests and outlawed Christianity and killed a bunch of Christians. That idea of Japan as this closed system, there's part of me that understands that, but there's obviously part of me that laments that, doesn't want that to be a guiding light of Japan. That said, what I'll talk about here, and you'll hear it in the pages yourself, is an admiration for values that I wish other nations, other states, other peoples could reflect for themselves. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. It'll make more sense when I read some of this. It might seem a bit abstract at the moment. When Mr. Tanimoto, with his basin still in his hand, reached the park, it was very crowded, and to distinguish the living from the dead was not easy, for most of the people lay still, with their eyes open. To Father Kleinsorge, an Occidental, Father Kleinsorge was a German Jesuit priest, the silence in the grove by the river, where hundreds of gruesomely wounded suffered together, was one of the most dreadful and awesome phenomena of his whole experience. The hurt ones were quiet. No one wept, much less screamed in pain. No one complained. None of the many who died did so noisily. Not even the children cried. Very few people even spoke. And when Father Kleinsorge gave water to some whose faces had been almost blotted out by flash burns, they took their share and then raised themselves a little and bowed to him in thanks. So I'm not saying that if any other culture had been bombed, that this might not have been their behavior as well, but that particular last moment where these people have flash burns, almost blotting out their face, and yet they still had enough of that cultural programming that I've received a gift from someone, I must bow. That's so embedded in who they are as a people. And it was such a interesting reflection that Japanese culture, when confronted with catastrophe, is not going to sit and scream and cry and wail, even though they're in great pain. Even though they said some of them died, they didn't die noisily. They did so quietly, and in the polite way that the Japanese would. Another thing that's interesting is Japanese society is so well run that even when an atomic bomb is dropped on your city, you're still able to find people. Listen to this. Several days later, Father Cieslik started hunting for the children's family. So these are some children who had been lost in the bombing. He learned through the police that an uncle had been to the authorities in Kure, a city not far away, to inquire for the children. After that, he heard that an older brother had been trying to trace them through the post office in Ujina, a suburb of Hiroshima. Still later, he heard that the mother was alive and was on Goto Island off Nagasaki. And at last, by keeping a check on the Ujina post office, he got in touch with the brother and returned the children to their mother. Japan is so well functioning as a bureaucracy that in the days after a nuclear bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, you could go to a post office in a Hiroshima suburb and help lost children find their family. It's such a well-functioning country, but part of that is it's been around, that culture's been around for 5,000 years. They figured out how to run things. There's also this connection to the emperor, which is of its time. I don't think the Japanese have the same connection to the emperor now, but in this time period, listen to this. There set a loudspeaker in the ruins of the station. Many civilians, all of them were in bondage, some being helped by the shoulders of their daughters, some sustaining their injured feet by sticks. They listened to the broadcast, and when they came to realize the fact that it was the emperor, they cried with full tears in their eyes. What a wonderful blessing it is that Tenno himself calls on us, and we can hear his own voice in person. We are thoroughly satisfied in such a great sacrifice. When they came to know that the war was ended, that is, Japan was defeated, they of course were deeply disappointed, but followed after their emperor's commandment in calm spirit, making wholehearted sacrifice for the everlasting peace of the world, and Japan started her new way. And here is something interesting. The author, Hersey, is reflecting this pivot that because of the trust of the Japanese in their emperor and that idea of following a leader, the person who is the father of your nation, which is how much more easily a monarch is considered such than just some person you hire for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years and you can get rid of that person if you don't like him. You don't get rid of the father or the mother of your country. And you see that reflected here. Now, obviously things have changed in Japan since that time, but what you're seeing here is much more contiguous with Japanese cultural history for thousands of years. What has happened in Japan in the last 60, 80, 100 years is a blip. It's effectively an anomaly in Japanese history. And same thing in Russia, same thing in a number of other places. And what is more than likely is a return in the future to the historical realities of who Japan is, of what Japan is, or not who Japan is, what Japan is, rather than a continuation of the current status quo. That's a conversation probably for another time. Here's more of what I was alluding to. Dr. Hiraiwa, professor of Hiroshima University of Literature and Science and one of my church members, was buried by the bomb under the 2-storied house with his son, a student of Tokyo University. Both of them could not move an inch under tremendously heavy pressure, and the house already caught fire. His son said, "Father, we can do nothing except make our mind up to consecrate our lives for the country. Let us give banzai to our emperor." Then the father followed after his son, "Tennoheka, banzai, banzai, banzai." In the result, Dr. Hiraiwa said, "Strange to say, I felt calm and bright and peaceful spirit in my heart when I chanted banzai to Tenno." Afterward, his son got out and digged down and pulled out his father, and thus they were saved. In thinking of their experience of that time, Dr. Hiraiwa repeated, what a fortunate thing that we are Japanese. It was my first time I ever tasted such a beautiful spirit when I decided to die for our emperor." Miss Kayoko Nobutoki, a student of Girls High School Hiroshima Jazubuin, and a daughter of my church member, was taking rest with her friends beside the heavy fence of the Buddhist temple. At the moment the atomic bomb was dropped, the fence fell upon them. They could not move a bit under such a heavy fence, and then smoke entered into even a crack and choked their breath. One of the girls began to sing Kimi ga Yo, the national anthem, and others followed in chorus and died. Meanwhile, one of them found a crack and struggled hard to get out. When she was taken in the Red Cross hospital, she told how her friends died, tracing back in her memory to singing in chorus our national anthem. They were just 13 years old. So the idea that these high school girls, as they're dying, knowing that they're going to die, choking on smoke, are singing the Japanese national anthem, it's astonishing. Something that I can't imagine many other nations, much less my own, doing. If you're enjoying this content, please consider hitting like, subscribe. It's an easy way to get this content out to people who might appreciate hearing about books that they may not otherwise have heard about. In referring to those who went through the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, the Japanese tended to shy away from the term survivors, because in its focus on being alive, it might suggest some slight to the sacred dead. The class of people to which Nakamura-san belonged came, therefore, to be called by a more neutral term, hibakusha, literally explosion-affected persons. For more than a decade after the bombings, the hibakusha lived in an economic limbo, apparently because the Japanese government did not want to find itself saddled with anything like moral responsibility for heinous acts of the victorious United States. Although it soon became clear that many hibakusha suffered consequences of their exposure to the bombs, which were quite different in nature and degree from those of survivors even of the ghastly firebombings in Tokyo and elsewhere, the government made no special provision for their relief until, ironically, after the storm of rage that swept across Japan, when the 23 crewmen of a fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, and its cargo of tuna were irradiated by the American test of a hydrogen bomb at Bikini in 1954. It took 3 years even then for a relief law for the hibakusha to pass the diet. As Nakamura-san struggled to get from day to day, she had no time for attitudinizing about the bomb or anything else. She was sustained curiously by a kind of passivity, summed up in a phrase she herself sometimes used, shikata ga nai, meaning loosely, it can't be helped. She was not religious, but she lived in a culture long colored by the Buddhist belief that resignation might lead to clear vision. It's interesting, this phrase, shigata ga nai, it can't be helped. I thought through this aloud with some friends. We agreed that in the United States, the phrase, it is what it is probably the American equivalent to this with much less philosophical overtone. As you can see, shigata ga nai is based in a Buddhist culture. It is what it is was a phrase that came into American parlance through a sports team. I think it was the Philadelphia Eagles. And in the UK, it might be fair enough, or that's football if you're in the North. That's how it is, and you just have to accept it. And that's an idea that's prevalent in many cultures. But what I mean to say is this particular phrase is embedded in a Buddhist tradition in Japan, and it forms part of how people understand themselves in the culture. And it's coherent and it's cohesive because the Japanese nation is also a people, and that makes understanding it, understanding them, understanding the culture much easier for those of us who are outside of it, but also it makes it easier for those living inside the culture. Whereas something like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which has become those countries have become very confused over the last 25 years in particular. They don't really know what they are. I used to just say it was the United States, but I don't think Canada knows what it is either. All they just claim to be is a nation of immigrants, but that effectively means that you're nothing in particular. And that's a crisis that a country will have to deal with. If you don't know who you are as a country, then you can't possibly know where you come from or where you're going to. The Japanese very much know who they are, where they came from, and where they're going. And I think that's part of how they can be set up for success. Although, as you can see, with their shocking birth rate, they've lost belief in who they are as a people. And that's why they're headed in a death spiral. That's a conversation for another time. Here's one more example. Beyond his own stubborn sense of mission, he had taken on himself the Japanese spirit of enryo, setting the self apart, putting the wishes of others first. And I couldn't really think of an equivalent to this idea, putting the wishes of others first, setting the self apart as a cultural value. This is a word in Japanese. And it seems to be thought of as positively. I can't think of an equivalent in the American English idiom that offers such a spirit of sacrifice, of working for the betterment of the community and worrying less about yourself. So if someone can think of that, please feel free to put that in the comments. I'd love to hear more. And if any of the comments that I've made so far, if you come from the Japanese background or you've read this text, feel free to chime in. I'm always happy to hear your comments. If you'd like to get a copy of this book, you can see it's not a very long one. It's well worth your read. I'll put a link in the description to where you can get a copy. That's one of the easy ways you can support this channel. As I've already said, you can support us for free by hitting like, subscribe, share, hype, get this out to more people. If you'd like to thank me for this presentation, there's links to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee below. If you'd like to support me on an ongoing basis and get early access to videos like this one, as well as an exclusive video once per month, you can find links to Patreon and YouTube membership. If you'd like to buy a book for the future, nominate it for one of these videos, my Amazon wish list is below. You'll see books of all kinds, including books on Palestine. If you're interested in that, there's my Palestine bookshelf project, which you can learn more about. But otherwise, buy a book, send it my way, and I'll do my best to review it in a timely manner. Until next time, enjoy your reading.